So this is part 2 of the PlayStation 2 review for Gun. This part will deal with yet more positive issues, but also, for the sake of balance, deal with some potential downsides to the game. To begin with, the riding mechanics in Gun are decent, with the ability to trample enemies, which is just another great wee touch to add to all those I've already mentioned. As someone who's ridden horses quite a bit, I can safely say that using the analog stick and pressing and holding down L2 is really as close to reality and real riding as it gets. The guns in Gun are functional, with pistols, rifles, bows, sniper rifles, shotguns, dynamite and molotovs to play with. They're nothing special, but really this isn't Doom. This isn't Quake. You don't really expect to be shooting railguns and BFGs and things, so you can really forgive the fact that they're not anything to wow you, but they're all quite functional and they play fairly differently. You'll be picking up more powerful versions throughout the game, so upgrades, and you can pick whichever one you want. They have slightly different stats. However, finding ammo other than that for the rifle is not always easy, depending on where you are. But it's not really a major issue for the game. It's usually things like trying to find sniper rifle ammo, trying to find shotgun ammo isn't always the easiest thing, but really you can power through most of the game with just the rifle, so that's not usually too much of a problem. The throwing mechanics for dynamite or barrels of TNT is again really easy to perform properly without blowing yourself up, unlike in other games where explosives are as dangerous to you as your enemy, and you really just don't want to use them because for fear of actually blowing yourself up. The music in the game is grandiose and suits the game's serious nature and sounds great. A final positive to mention has to be the game's constant checkpointing, which you won't even realize it's happening. It's not like the game suddenly judders to a halt. You'll just die and return to a place usually a few seconds before. It's so ridiculously well implemented that progress is constant throughout the game, which probably makes Gun a briefer, but ultimately a more enjoyable experience to play through, because you're not repeating things over and over again. Now, I've talked my mouth off about this game's just sheer amount of positives, and it's only fair and balanced to really mention the game's weaker points, or any possible downsides. Personally, as I said in part 1, there are no deal breakers for me, or anything even remotely resembling a deal breaker. Upon looking at this game's release date, however, I did notice that there was a controversy surrounding the depiction of Native Americans in the game, and while I didn't notice it really the first time I played the game, upon playing it the second time I kept my mind open to this depiction to see whether or not there was any kind of solid basis for the controversy. Now, I really like Gun, as should be obvious from my review, but I have to admit, particularly at the beginning of the game, looking again from perhaps a slightly more sympathetic viewpoint, it doesn't do anything to challenge the kind of semi-barbaric stereotype that you've seen in films stretching back decades. It's no worse than anything you've seen elsewhere, and I'm absolutely sure the developers had no intention of deliberately offending anyone. And your character will later team up with Native American warriors, so the game isn't just one big native kill fest, basically. For me, this was never really an issue. My roots don't quite stretch across the Atlantic, so I'm giving a slightly, hopefully neutral perspective on this one. And I never really thought about this, but I thought I'd give my perception anyway, because if you had heard about the controversy, and let's be honest, there's very few of us who would knowingly go out and buy a racist game, so this game isn't racist. To recap, it's not any worse than you'd see in any black and white film, but then again, it doesn't do much to challenge the stereotypes, so it's a little bit of both. I mean, for me, it doesn't really affect the playing of the game at all, but I thought I'd tackle this hot potato in my review, if not at least to give some balance to this whole thing. But as I said, it doesn't really affect the playing the game. If you happen to be of Native American ancestry, I could see why it might be a little bit offensive. But I think for everyone else, they're not really going to notice it all that much, to be fair. So on to other issues in the game. Other possible issue for the game is the game length. I've come across a few opinions which kind of believed that this game was too short-lived. Personally, I thought it was just an ideal length, but that may have been due to the lack of time I had when I played it on both occasions. It's very straight to the point. If you play games for hours each day, you can probably complete Gun in a week quite comfortably. For those who play maybe an hour or so here and there, taking into account different levels of ability, if you need to repeat sections, it probably won't last you much longer than 3 weeks. 2 or 3 weeks really at the best. That's with completing all the side missions as well, which are pretty much vital in getting the best value for money. All that said, this is a very streamlined game, which means that unlike other games where you have hour after hour of travelling and boring filler just to kind of increase the game's length, this game is virtually enjoyable 100% of the time. Even though it was incredibly enjoyable, it wasn't such a brief trip that as, say, in Star Trek Voyager on the PC, which I reviewed, I wasn't still gagging for more by the end of the game. So when the game came to a close, it felt right that it should end when it did. A final point is the end boss is another puzzle boss. Not something I prefer in games, and one that took me longer than I would have liked. It probably won't spoil the game for most people, but for me it was a teensy bit annoying just because I kind of loathe puzzle bosses, especially if I don't get it within the first minute or so. But anyway, my conclusion is this: Gun is a ballsy title for a game. It doesn't disappoint. Gun has to be one of the most user-friendly games I've ever come across. It plays like an absolute dream. The story is perhaps not a 20-hour slugfest, but is enjoyable right to the very end, which is why I genuinely say that this is really a must-buy for any open-world adventure fans who own any of the consoles this game exists on. Even if you complete it in a week, it will be time well spent and well enjoyed. And you can pick this game up fairly cheap these days, and I would still heartily recommend looking out for it. This game is epic in its scope and storytelling, and while it's not quite as enjoyable the second time around as it was the first, which is the case with most games, its sheer class makes it stand out from the crowd. If every game had as much respect for the player as Gun shows, in making directions clear, objectives clear, and really being devoid of numerous irritations, then there would really be no need for reviews, as every game would be deserving of a high score. So is this a modern classic? A phrase that I sometimes like to use, and many others, I'm sure. Perhaps. Time will tell. I might come back to this in a decade or so, and that will be the time to see if this game stands the test of time. But for the moment, I'm going to be conservative and say that it's one of the best games I've played on the PS2. That much is very easy to say. It completely deserves its reputation. I was someone who had to be won over to this, and I was won over very quickly, even though against all other kind of preconceptions of Wild West and whatever else like that, it completely deserves its reputation, and at the very least it is a very, 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 very well made game. So I give Gun an 8.2 out of 10. And that's me.